recently, we know that Dr. Kissinger paid visit to China and secretly, and not secretly as the last time, as maybe 50 years ago, but it's still a private visit. So, in your opinion, what role does this visit play in the Sino-US relations? It will benefit it a lot, or it's just a kind of maybe a ceremony or something more like a formality?
Dr. Kissinger's recent visit to China was meticulously planned over a number of months. As you know, he has had a desire to maintain his relationship with China for the 52 years since he first made his secret visit to Beijing, arriving up through Pakistan. That's been a consistent theme of his engagement with China. And this latest trip, which occurred 52 years after the first trip and shortly after his 100th birthday, represented a trip of particular significance to him, not simply because of his age, not simply because of the opportunity to revisit old friends and places like guest house number 5 at Diaoyutai that have a great historical resonance for him, but also because of a sense that this is a crucial moment in the bilateral relationship, and that the underlying principles that led to the establishment of relationships 52 years ago should remain intact. That it is important that each side respect and understand the interests of its others, which is not to say that the United States should not vigorously pursue its own interests or that China should not vigorously pursue its interests. But the fundamental Kissingerian logic is to find a way in the connection between those two different sets of interests to develop a productive relationship.
Yes, I have heard that both the White House and the State of Defense, and they also value it, and they think, okay, it's a really important channel, and they even feel jealous that, okay, Dr. Kissinger can visit Beijing, meet Li Shangfu generally, but General Austin could not have a meeting with General Li. So, do you think it will be some really after visit negotiation or some communication between that China and the US? For example, would President Biden invite Dr. Kissinger for some advice?
A feature of all of Dr. Kissinger's trips to China that I've been involved with, and that I've certainly known as long as I've worked with him, has been that they are an opportunity for him to listen and to learn and understand the Chinese point of view, and then convey that back as a private citizen to relevant figures in the United States. One of Dr. Kissinger's great skills, to be honest, is his ability to listen. Its ability to understand based not just on his 50 plus years of dealings with China, but also his understanding of the situation in the United States, and try to find opportunities to explain to each side the perspectives of the other. This trip, coming at the time that it does, is no less significant. And I think it's obviously remarkable that a 100-year-old figure who has every reason to stay at home and rest and read and enjoy his time feels such a tremendous responsibility to the bilateral relationship and to the world that he's willing to make a trip at this time of such importance to both sides.
So we also heard that both the Dr. Kissinger and you and many observers, and they focus on maybe the possible war or conflict between China and the US. And we recently read that Ray Dalio, and he thinks that China and the US are on the brink of war. And I think he's quite pessimistic. So I think there would be a war. The only thing we need to do is prevent it become a nuclear war. So what's your opinion, how to avoid the worst scenario?
I think it's incredibly important that any sort of scenario that involves an open conflict or dramatically deteriorating relationship between the two sides be avoided. And it's important not simply for the two nations, but for the whole world. It's worth realizing that there's a great tragedy in a conflict between the United States and China, should it turn in that direction. But it's also true that there's a great tragedy in an inability to cooperate between the two sides, given the incredible challenges that the world is facing today on areas such as global warming, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, economics, refugee flows. There's a long list of issues which affect every single person on the planet. And the tragedy of the two sides not working together on these issues is in some senses as serious an issue to be considered as an open conflict between the two sides. You know, Dr. Kissinger for a long time has had an idea that the most important way to preserve the relationship between the two in a productive fashion, between the two countries in a productive fashion, is to always maintain a ratio of positive activity and competitive activity. It's inevitable that in relations between two great powers, there's going to be conflict and tension, and certainly to some degree, areas of disagreement. That's an inevitable part of different nations with different interests. The challenge is to find and amplify the areas of common interest, which then will create a setting in which the areas of conflict and discussion and competing interests can be discussed. So as we look at the world ahead, I think it can be a little bit simple-minded to say, well, we're definitely on a particular path to conflict. There's many paths that are available to the United States and China. Some of them are very unfortunate, tragic, horrible scenarios, and some of them are quite promising, engaging, helpful scenarios for the whole planet and for the two nations. So I think it's understanding that range of scenarios that are available, that range of paths that are possible, and trying to figure out which ones we can pursue that have the most mutual benefit for the two countries and for the world.
I have heard that you named some areas where maybe the China US can cooperate with each other, and where do you think we can start?
Yeah, so I would say the most important thing, first of all, is to understand philosophically and strategically what the aim of the two sides are. And it's only on that basis of understanding the intention. What is the intention of the engagement between the two sides that we can pick particular areas in which to operate. The intention has got to be to find a way to create an energy and a dynamic between the two sides that permits cooperation on areas that are of vital interest to both sides. With that framework established, the natural areas for cooperation, as I see it, are first of all economic and financial policy. It's extraordinarily important for both countries that we find a way to bring our trading relations and our financial relations back into a way that's beneficial for both sides. The challenge of doing that is one that exists both from a policy perspective, but also, to be honest, from a financial, from an industrial, and from a commercial perspective. But serious and intensive work in finding ways to develop situations where through trade and finance, each side can support the needs of the other is an area of primary concern. And it's concerned not only because the productive energies that can be released from that sort of arrangement, but also, to be honest, we're heading into a world where the risks of financial crisis and serious trade wars are only growing. And so beginning to develop new frameworks to think about those things is very important. So finance and economic engagement. And the second area I think is obviously extremely important is on questions of technological development, particularly at the very cutting edge of technology and things related to artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biological development. The speed and the pace of change is so incredibly rapid, and the potential benefits to humanity are so immense that the fundamental challenge there is to figure out how do you accelerate and drive the development of these technologies while ensuring that they're safe and ensuring that they don't translate into a military-style arms race. And so rolling up our sleeves and really getting engaged on these difficult questions of the most advanced technology is also a very important area. A third area that I think is essential is discussion about the larger problems of the global commons. That includes things like the environment, but frankly, it also includes issues like fundamental problems of regional war and peace, problems of agreeing on arms control for all kinds of new weapons systems, and focusing on things like refugee flows, humanitarian aid, food supply, and increasingly, as we see every day in the news, the management of the crises that are unfolding as the result of climate change. So having the opportunity to sit between the two sides and figure out what can be done, what resources each side could develop is also very important. But I think a fourth area, and the last area I'll highlight that's extremely important, is going to have to do with expanding cultural, intellectual, and philosophical exchanges between the two sides. As somebody who has now worked for more than 20 years between the two countries and spends a lot of time going back and forth between the two countries, it's remarkable to me today the difficulty the two sides have in understanding each other and seeing the other side as it is. And so the expansion of that landscape of cultural, philosophical, intellectual engagement is really an essential precursor, I think, to those other areas of development. But that's a very broad menu of things to be done. The possibility for a rich, engaged dialogue between the two nations absolutely exists if we can begin with this idea that the aim here is to have a productive, generative discussion between the two sides. Then there's plenty of work to be done and plenty of opportunity to improve the situation.
Yes, I think the area the point is perfectly matched with these days the U.S. officials who pay with China, for example, Blinken and Yellen and Kerry, and maybe next month is Raimondo. And how do you evaluate these officials' visit to China? Is it helpful or is it only some useless communication?
The challenge between the United States and China now is really to develop not simply channels of regular contact, but channels of regular understanding. So the ability for American officials to travel to China and Chinese officials to travel to the United States and see the countries as they are, meaning not simply from a policy perspective, but from an economic perspective, a domestic political perspective, a technological perspective. It's only in the deepening of the understanding of the nature of the opposite country that each country is going to be able to evaluate its own interests, understand what it's dealing with. So communication between the two sides, high-level visits are very important, but I think all of us who are concerned about the direction of the relationship feel that it's extremely important that that be fit into a larger context. So these initial steps are extremely important, and they will hopefully lead to the establishment of a context that both sides can agree on about what we're trying to accomplish together.
You just mentioned the domestic politics. You may also aware that in Washington and especially in the media and the capital, there is some emotion of anti-China. If the Blinken pay ways to China, and they will feel a great pressure from the congressman and from the media how to solve this problem by people-to-people exchange or some other solutions.
I think it requires a very comprehensive solution, which is, I think, first of all, being honest about the fact that there are substantial differences in interests, in values, and approach between the two countries, and accepting that as an inevitable part of dealing with nations that have different histories and different current domestic situations. Having said that, once that's done, I do think it is extremely important that at every level of the system, there's an attempt to develop a better understanding of the other side. That means at the highest political level to understand the nature of what's occurring in China and the political goals, or for the Chinese to understand the dynamics inside the United States in a way that's accurate. But it's also important that elites in both countries understand each other and see the possibility for mutually beneficial interactions, and that the people of each country begin to support that from a domestic standpoint. But the key is devising a system, devising an intellectual model that clearly establishes a relationship where each side is able to extract benefits from an improved overall relationship. One of Dr. Kissinger's most famous line is that the acid test of international relations is domestic politics. And that continues to be true. If you're not in a situation where the domestic politics support the nature of the policy that's being pursued, it won't be able to be sustainable.
And you may also know that Dr. Kissinger is really familiar with Chinese culture, and he can even talking philosophy with Premier Zhou Enlai and Chairman Mao Zedong. And now many Chinese experts in US, and they like erase Fu Gaoyi, and he is also passed away. Would you think there is a new generation of China school who are familiar with China, both in the policy circle or cultural circle?
First of all, I think that all of us owe a great debt to figures like Vogel or Doak Barnett. It's interesting, if you go back and read the writing of people like Doak Barnett, it holds up remarkably well. Their ability to try to see and understand China it really reflects a kind of scholarship that I think anybody who is interested to understand any nation should aspire to. There is a new generation of China scholars that are emerging in the United States. And China itself is so new and so different. Sometimes I kind of wish that, Doak Barnett in a way was still around and could see what China had become, because these people really gave, or Fairbank, people really gave their lives to understanding contemporary China, but with this anchor in a deep understanding of traditional Chinese culture. And I think for those of us who live and work in China, it's consistently, I was in Beijing seeing some people a number of weeks ago, and it is remarkable always to me the depth that traditional Chinese culture is reflected in everyday conversations and everyday life in China. And so it's the grounding of that traditional, these deep, deep traditions of China, fused with the incredible rush to modernity of the last 20 or 30 years, that represents really one of the most interesting and I think important areas for trying to understand where China is today and where it's going. This new generation of Chinese scholars that I see emerging in the United States and in Europe is very impressive in some degrees. Many of them had a chance to live in China in a way that, the earlier generation of Chinese scholars, many of them lived in China because they were the children of missionaries. This generation has a very different experience. They traveled to China, they lived there, they spent as much time going out for drinks and getting to know a young generation of Chinese as maybe the missionary generation spent proselytizing to a younger generation of Chinese. So their feel for Chinese culture, fundamentally comes from a very different place. I'm fairly confident that what you will see over the next period of time is the emergence of a group of scholars with interesting, engaging, helpful and useful ideas about what's actually happening in China, who really are trying in that spirit of the Doak Barnetts of the world to produce scholarship that can be read in 100 years and still will feel like it is relevant and objective and accurate.
You also know that some Americans, they think Dr. Kissinger's diplomacy is quite old-fashioned and is secret. And so, do you think this kind of diplomacy is outdated? And will there be still a stabilizer and in the Sino-US relations in the future?
My view is that Kissinger-style diplomacy is perhaps more important now than it has ever been in some degrees, because the essence of Kissinger-style diplomacy really is to listen to the other side and use creativity and flexibility to find opportunities that didn't exist. One of Dr. Kissinger's favorite statesmen that he studied for many years is Bismarck. And Bismarck had this famous line that the job of a statesman is not to make things happen, it's to listen to the sound of God passing by and grab onto his hem as he moves. And that notion of grabbing the trend of the times, grabbing the energy of an age to direct policy in a productive fashion is exactly what's reflected in Kissinger's diplomacy. And that requires a kind of slowness, a kind of quietness, a kind of directness. Over the years, I spent a lot of time, obviously, with Dr. Kissinger, meeting with various foreign heads of state in China and elsewhere. But I'll tell you, one meeting that really stayed with me is a conversation maybe 15 years ago, maybe even a little longer than that. We were having tea one day with the famous Chinese diplomat Huang Hua. And Dr. Kissinger and Huang Hua got into a long discussion about the nature of diplomacy between the two sides. And Huang Hua said, the most important thing in diplomacy is not to begin with the particular problem you have, but to think about the larger environment, the context in which it's occurring. And only once you've done that can you begin to find opportunities. And Dr. Kissinger said, I completely agree with that sentiment. So I think Kissinger-style diplomacy is not simply reflected in the day-to-day engagement, the day-to-day diplomatic activities. It is very much reflected in the kind of habits and the tactics, but also in this larger strategic view about saying to yourself, what's the nature of the age in which we're living? And what does that suggest about what we can accomplish diplomatically and how we should accomplish it?
You just mentioned that the world is changed and now is the age of the unthinkable. And you have published the book maybe more than maybe 14 years ago. And nowadays, with the, I think, COVID-19 and Ukraine war and the AI revolution and the US-China and the likely Cold War and climate disaster, and we always feel frustrated sometimes, and okay, it's chaos. And from your perspective how to evaluate the new world disorder from now?
So the essential insight of that book, The Age of the Unthinkable, was that the underlying physics of power in the world was in the process of changing. And that the traditional dynamics of power, in which you mostly had large nation states that were the essential actors, was shifting to a world in which nation states still matter, but in which you had a massive expansion of the number of actors, the number of technologies, the number of connections between them, and that produced a new quality in the nature of how power was distributed in the world. One of the results of that is that the system itself became more and more complex. And it's important to understand there's a distinction between a complicated system and a complex system. A complicated system is something like an airplane engine. It has maybe 1 million parts, but you can assemble it over and over again, and it's very predictable in how it behaves. That's a complicated system. A complex system is different. A complex system is like a jungle, where you may also have millions of interacting pieces and animals and species, but it's very hard to predict what the outcome is going to be. And in our world today, there's a lot of these complex systems, these networks of many interconnected points. It's simply that the nature of how equilibrium is achieved is very different, and that the system is filled with many risks that are quite challenging to manage and require fundamentally a new disposition as you think about the nature of the world. So that the essential idea of the Age of the Unthinkable was trying to shift our way of thinking about power in the world away from an older way of thinking and towards this notion of when you have to manage a complex network with many interacting factors, it requires a different approach. It doesn't require giving up, doesn't require simply believing that the world is going to become chaotic, but it requires a very different instinct. And I think we've seen since the book came out in 2008 an acceleration of that. And so the heart of, an idea like we're living in a time of changes unprecedented in 100 years, or we're living in an age of the unthinkable, very much comes from the fact that the fundamental nature of the system of power in the system is changing. The other thing I'd say is that process is still underway, that when you have a highly connected system in which really the nature and power of networks decides how the world is going to function, those networks themselves are changing. They're becoming faster. They're becoming more interconnected. They're becoming denser. They're becoming increasingly filled with machine intelligence. And so the complexity of that dynamic is not getting any less. And the essential challenge of statesmanship, first of all, to understand that that's going on, that the dynamics are different. And secondly, to begin to devise and create policies that will allow us to manage that sort of world without descending into the kind of tragedy that's accompanied those sort of shifts in the past.
Yes. I think it's quite like the philosophy of maybe from the French philosopher like Descartes or the Lao Tzu. The only thing not change is change. And so,
yeah.
But yes, many normal people, and they need the security. They need to fix on something. And do you think there is something we can hold?
I mean, there must be. As you said, I mean, what's fascinating to me is it has always been the fundamental problem of Chinese political philosophy, right? Because the oldest texts of Chinese political thinking is the Book of Changes. So the premise of and the question of how you manage change is deeply embedded in a lot of classical Chinese philosophy. Western philosophy, which is also magnificent, begins at a different point with a different set of questions. But this is the challenge for us today, which is how do we find a philosophy, a political system that maintains its legitimacy, not simply in a world of dramatically reframed power, because that's happening, but even more challenging in the transition of one world of power distributions to another world of power distributions. Because in that process, many things that were successful and prosperous and powerful in the old system are not going to be successful, powerful, and prosperous in the new system. And so getting through that transition where there are winners and losers, where you have a race between wonderful technologies and the terrible things that they can do, this is really the challenge that our generation is going to have to confront.
Yes. So last is about you're also very concentrate on the youth and the young people. And do you have some suggestions for for them to how to adapt to the age of unthinkable. For example, which skills they can learn are how to accumulate their experience in this shifted and world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for the next generation is that many of the structures and systems that people might have used 30 years ago to establish a career for themselves are beginning to change. And so the answer to your question is going to emerge in the coevolution between the demands of a younger generation and the structures of a society that can provide for them the things that they need. But it's going to require a very different political and economic design, because the current system, first of all, is unsustainable from an environmental perspective, probably in some cases from an economics and financial perspective. But it's also a system that, as it has more and more crises, is going to become less and less legitimate in the eyes of many figures. And so the challenge then is really, how do you begin building a political order that creates the opportunity for people to have stable, prosperous, engaged, meaningful lives, both in a world of radical technological change and as we migrate through that process. You know, we've already seen over the last decade or so the impact of social media on the minds of a whole generation. And it hasn't been good in many senses. You've seen the impact in terms of mental health and other things. And I think the arrival of machine intelligence represents another threat. So this is a question I think an awful lot about, which is, how do you prepare people? How do you develop a new generation of leaders that can channel the energies of this technology into what's embedded in it? Because all of this technology, which is really the root of this revolutionary age, is a technological shift. It's a shift in knowledge. Fundamentally embedded in it is the possibility for an amazing life. It's a possibility for lives that are longer, that are healthier, that are filled with opportunity, that are sustainable. All of these things are the essence of what's possible. The puzzle is, how do we achieve that? And there's a real urgency to thinking about and working on that problem.